Welcome to another segment of provocative conversations destined to provoke further thought and spark greater questions regarding God, church, and the religious establishments of both the past and the present. I am the proud heretic, Mr. Provocateur himself. Hello, I am the proud heretic, Mr. Provocateur himself. Continuing on in my subtopic, the prophetic utterances that God gave me regarding the church in direct relation to the church. Again, we're speaking on the divine season of the pandemic. I know on my last recording, I was rough. I was tough. I used words that were harsh. Harsh to the ear, harsh to the psyche, but true to the context. I meant what I said what I meant. It is what it is. If you choose to not listen, then that's on you. But I'm going to still speak it. Whether you like it or not, I'm not here to offend, but I do know that what I speak and how I speak will offend, and it is what it is. It has to be what it is. I know that I speak boldly and I speak hard. I walk hard, but I love harder. Trust me. At the end of the day, I'm still going to do right. You can't get to everyone who you've offended. It's not possible in many cases. And even if you could get to those individuals, will they be open for your apology or whatever, for you righting the matter? Some things you have to get it right with God, get it right with yourself, and then you just have to keep moving on. But if you can get it right with others, you should. There's a relief in it, a release and a relief in it for both them and you. But anyway, continuing on, understand that God told me that I'm not to fear the church, that I am not to fear the message that I am to bring the church. Therefore, I do not fear. I do not fear the church. I purposely do not fear the church. I know that the church is an entity that lauds itself, applauds itself, thrives upon teaching messages that gets people to fearing. I come against that. I speak against that. I have to, because God told me to bring it with boldness, with clarity, with assuredness. He told me to be assured of what I'm speaking and stand bold in it and proclaim it. Do it with a conviction. Do it with assuredness, knowing that this is my hour to speak forth what it is that I am to speak forth. And I am not the only one who's going to come forth. Many others, I'm sure, will be coming forth too, because this world is big and God is using who God is using. It is true. Listen to the church. Church, God says the church has lost its position in society. He says society is no longer dependent upon the church. Listen, there was a time where our society was totally dependent upon the church. All the entities that be, the systems that be, individuals, households, communities, they were dependent upon the church. God says society is no longer dependent upon the church. The Bible speaks about a thing. It says in the book of Proverbs, it says that depending on a broken tooth to chew steak. If you depend on a broken tooth or a loose tooth in the back of your mouth to chew on steak meat, man, you're going to have a time trying to pull that off. You don't depend on a broken tooth or a bad tooth to chew on steak. You don't depend on a broken leg, it's not going to get you there. Not hardly. And even if it gets you there, it's going to mess you up worse. You've agitated the situation worse. Well, society has gotten to a point now that they understand that the church is nothing more than a broken leg. God says society is no longer looking for the church because the church has been absent so long. Why do you think that none of the protests and none of the movement of this pandemic season came from the church? Society has moved on from the church. Society has come to understand that the church is not going to get it done. We need to go do this ourselves, you all. Don't depend on these preachers. Don't depend on them. God says society's dependence upon the church is broken. The dependency upon the church by society has been severed, divinely severed. God says, I have severed their dependency. I have severed the dependency of society upon the church. He says only the systems within society are dependent upon the church. He says only the systems within society are dependent upon the church. Why? Because the systems receive their flow, their functionality through the church. Who founded the systems? The very ones who founded the church. What did they founder first? The church, not the systems, but the church. So everything that came beyond the church came from, all right, then the church. Only those within the mechanical workings of the systems still have their dependency or dependence upon the church. If you are within the systems and you embedded in it, you are dependent upon the portion of the church that keeps your system working. The economic world, the health world, the legal world, the political world, and all in between. The systems within society have always had their dependency upon the church. The church has always depended upon the systems, and the systems have always depended upon the church. God says the church is lucrative to the systems. The systems need what the church brings to the table. The church is so beneficial, so lucrative, so palm greasing to the systems that be. And the systems that be are just as lucrative and promising and beneficial to the palms, the greasing of the palms of the church. The two are codependent upon each other, God says. God says the church is nothing but a system. It's nothing more than a system within systems, a system within the systems. God says the church is the system that keeps the other systems functioning. I know that's hard. I know that people can't see that. But God says the church is the head leader of the systems. God says the church is the headquarters of the systems that exist. The church is the headquarter of all systems. The church is not a trusted system, God says. The church is not a trusted system. Oh, why do we trust in it then? God says the church has never been a trusted system because the church was not founded upon trust. Oh, my goodness. God says the church has breached its own trust. The church has breached its own ability to be trusted. He says the church is no longer to be trusted. God says, let me say that again. He says the church is no longer to be trusted. God says, do not trust the workings of the church. Do not trust the teachings of the church. For the church's teachings are distorted. The church's teachings are a distorted version of the truth. Wow. No wonder when you hear people say, like I heard Kenneth Copeland say, you know, judgment is coming upon us because of abortion, and not just us only. And definitely the Democratic Party. When I say us, I'm not talking about us in the Democrat, because I'm not in the Democrat Party. Though I do, in this season right here, I do see where the Democratic side of things is doing more toward the newness that God is bringing forth than the Republican side is bringing. Because the Republican side is bringing back what has already been. God is doing something completely and totally different. The Republican side of things is saying, let's get America back to what it was. We don't want to go back to what it was. Isn't that what the children of Israel wanted to do? They wanted to bring things back to where it was. We can't do that. It wasn't good for everybody, and it's not even good for anybody. And if it is good, then why is God bringing us all into a new? Why is the pandemic season here? Wake up, church. Wake up, people. Anyhow, it makes sense as to why the church would say crazy stuff like supporting Muslims, a Muslim in office, in a position of office. He was really, and they are really referring to the Democratic side of things, because you got a few people who are in the Muslim religion. This isn't a Muslim country. This is a Christian country. What are you talking about? When have we become so petty? You're no different than the Pharisees and the Sadducees of old. Like they say, that's why they're so sad. You see? That's why they're so sad. Listen, for you to sit and say who God is and who he isn't, to say what type country this is. This is a God life. This is a God world. Your Bible says, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So what are you talking about? It doesn't matter what the brand is. I know Jesus is the way, the truth, and the light, and no man come to the Father except through me. Behold, I am the door. If any man knocks, listen, if he's the door, then why in the hell are you embracing Israel so tight when they don't even believe in the Christ as being the Savior? Why are they still looking for the Savior? Silly. Why are they still looking for the Savior? And why are you thinking that all of these billions of Israelis who have died from the time of till right now, how do you think they all went to heaven? Oh, see, they're going to get a second chance. God has no respecter of persons. Yeah, I know you can go in the book and find all these twisted, crazy things, but it fights against his very nature. You're using verses that Jesus never used. You're wretched in your teaching, church. But anyway, let's keep going. God says the church has failed in its position, that the church has failed at upholding its position, that the church has failed in upholding its position within society. He says society must not be led by the church. Society must no longer be led by the church. And that's all the church is trying to do. They're trying to lead everything and everybody in society to believe and to think how they believe and think in relation to God. and forget all other religions, forget all other concepts, forget the different ways that God can come to a person. God doesn't think like we think. We would say God would never use that, yet he used the stick, yet he used the donkey, yet he used the foolishness of the gospel. That's what your Bible says. Society must not be led by the church, must no longer be led by the church, must remove itself from the leadership of the church. The church can no longer lead society. Policies must no longer be dictated to by the church. This is what God said to me. Yet at the same time, I hear these preachers and I hear the Copelands and the followers of Copeland saying, our Bible. Yep, your Bible said it was free for you all to own slaves, and that slaves were to obey you all, and that slaves were not to seek to be loose. Isn't that something? Why would you tell a grown man to not seek to be loose? Oh, I know why. Because that's your money maker. I know why. You know why. We know why. And history knows why. Because that's your cash box. They were bringing in your money. All you saw in the field was, every time you looked out your window into that field, you saw. Every time you saw a slave sweating and about to fall out, you were thinking about that's all you were thinking about. Outside of the women you had in the house, you had the pretty ones in the house. You wasn't concerned about you were concerned about. That's right. That's what you were concerned about. Listen, God says policies must no longer be dictated to by the church. Policies must no longer be representative of the church. Our policies, God says, are to now stop resembling the church. Stop representing the church. For the church has failed in its representation of God. The church has failed to represent. Church, you do not represent God. You represent some type of God, but not God. The people are no longer looking for the church to represent them, God says. The people are no longer looking for the church to lead them. They're no longer allowing others to lead them. The people are no longer waiting on others to lead them. The people, God says, are now leading their own cause. The people are being led to lead their own cause. God says the people see the need. The people see what is needed. The people see who is needed. The people are seeing more than what the church sees. The people's sight is of greater magnitude than that of the church. That's a shame that God is basically saying, since the church called itself the church and then everyone else is in the world, everyone else is the world. God says the world is doing better than the church. The world is in a better position to lead than the church is. The world is seeing the need more than the church is. They're seeing what is needed. When the church is missing what is needed, they're seeing who is needed, yet the church is not seeing at all. God says the people's sight, their sight is of greater magnitude than that of the church. God says the church is willfully blind to the things that are occurring. They are willfully blind. They're willingly remaining blind to what is happening. No wonder they're spitting out all of this stuff and they say, well, the United States is founded upon the Bible. Okay. The Quran is not. The Quran is not to be regarded as the law of the United States. You're so silly. Who wants the laws that created a people that had Jesus crucified? Come on, people. We're so twisted. But the church is full of lawbreakers at the top. That's like Donald Trump saying, I am the president of law and order. Says who? Tax evader? Says who? Most gracious liar of all? Says who? Says who? How are you that? And you're in bed with Putin when you were trying to get in bed with China. Come on, people. Ukraine. Come on, people. Let's wake up. Take the blinders off. God says they have willfully ignored and dismissed and denied what is occurring. That's exactly what the church has done in relation to Donald Trump, in relation to the cries of those protesters, whether they're Black Lives Matter. And shame on you, Kenneth Copeland, for saying that the entity itself is of a communist sort, a communist origin, because a group of people and groups of people around the world are saying Black lives do matter, that it is time for equality and justice. How do you sit there and say that other than because you have your own following and you have your mic? Where do you come off like that? What is wrong with you guys? Well, I know what's wrong with you. God said you're willfully ignorant and you've just ignored and dismissed and denied all of it. God says the church has chosen to stand in the position of wrong, and you don't even see it. Church has chosen to stand against the cause of the people. The church has chosen to stand against good and what is necessary for the people. I remember Kenneth Copeland saying something also, because when I say stand against the cause of the people, he said, well, it's the wealthy people who own the businesses and who hire people. Yes, you hire people for your own selfish gain. You hire people so that you can oppress them, so that you don't have to pay them, because the ones that you hire are the ones that you don't have to pay much at all for, so that you can make a bigger profit. You don't even want to cover them with insurance. You don't even want to cover them. You don't care about their kids. That fetus that they got at home as a baby now, that baby still needs formula. That baby still needs food. That baby still needs clothes. So why aren't you giving them this when you give it to the workers who are their parents? You're depriving the ones who bring it home to the fetuses that you were protecting. You're twisted. You're wrong. Let's keep going. The church has chosen to stand against good and what is necessary for the people. God says, this is why I stated that the church is not in the shift. He said, this is why the church is not in the shift. This is why the church cannot lead in the shift. Church, you are not in the shift. What God is doing, church, you are not in it. You cannot lead in the shift. The shifting has shaken you off. He says only that which is mobile is in the shift, which is why the church is not in the shift. For only that which is willing to mobilize is in the shift. Only that which is willing to mobilize is in the shift. See, he says the church is not mobile. The church isn't flexible. The church isn't moving. You can't lead in the shift if you're not moving. He says only that which is mobile is in the shift, which is why the church is not in the shift. For only that which is willing to mobilize is in the shift. The church isn't willing to mobilize. The church wants to remain right where it is and keep proselytizing and making folks twice the sons of hell as the church itself is. God says that which is immobile is incapable of shifting. He said the church is therefore incapable of shifting. Because the church is immovable. You won't be moved. You won't allow yourselves to be moved, and therefore is incapable of going with the shift. Wow. No wonder. Now, I use the term stand your ground for the sake of saying I got to stand on principle and I got to hold to what God has told me to do. But God is saying the church is using stand your ground for a whole different reason. The church is doing it because the church is just rebellious. God says the rebellious church, my people are rebellious. The pride of the people, the rebelhood of the people, makes them immovable and therefore incapable of going with the shift, which is why the church is being left, by the shift. God says the church is not a part of the shift. The church is not included in the shift. The church has no dealing in the shift. Notice God didn't use the shift or didn't use the church when he brought forth this shift. The church didn't even know this season was coming. Now, again, I say some people within the structure of the church or whatever, they knew because they heard God say something to them or whatever. I'm not talking about that. Stop using the exceptions to this as the method by which you either credit or discredit what I'm saying. For the whole of the church was not involved in this period. I didn't say individuals weren't involved in it. The church wasn't. The shift is occurring apart from the church. He's saying the shift is happening apart from the church. The shifting is occurring without the church, without the help of the church. The church thinks that they're supposed to be in everything and you're not supposed to throw a party or you're not supposed to move unless it cleared the desk of the church. The shifting is occurring without the help of the church. Look, church, God didn't need you. God needs the church. God needs the hands of the church to reach the world for himself. God didn't use you, church. God is using folk out on the streets to bring forth justice and equality. That's probably what the problem is. He didn't use the church. So now the church is upset and going along with the president, calling them anarchists and all of these other crazy names and calling them socialists and calling them Russian type communists, when the very commander in chief that they're supporting is the one who's always up the dooney of Putin. Oh, the twistedness of the church. The shifting is occurring apart from the church. The shifting is occurring without the church. The shifting is occurring without the help of the church. God says the church has no position in the shifting. That's the problem. The church is watching from the sidelines, he says. The church is watching the shifting and criticizing its every move. You're criticizing, church, the very move of God. You're watching it happen and you're criticizing it all the way. God says the church has no position in the shifting. You're just sitting on the sidelines watching it and criticizing every move that is being made during this pandemic season by those outside of the church that you didn't consider important or significant. God says the church is being critical of the shiftings, every move. The church is being critical of the shiftings, every move, not realizing what is occurring. The church cannot see that they are not included in the move. They have failed to realize that they are not even included in the move. The church is incapable of being included in the movement, God states. Amazing. The church is messed up because they're not included in the movement that God is bringing forth. Amazing. However, God is still doing it. Now, I'm going to keep reading this here, but I want to go back up to something. I'll finish this right here. The church cannot see that they are not included in the move. They have failed to realize that they are not even included in the movement. That was something that God gave me from September the 15th. But I want to go back further, and I want to go back to June the 3rd, and I want to continue from where I left off on June the 3rd. Because where I left off on June the 3rd had to do with it had to do with the lucrative. There you go, the lucrativeness of the church. All right. God says right here to me, he says to me, and let me finish that chain of thought, that line of teaching that I began with, and I kept saying I was going to come back to it and pick up from there. I was saying that to myself, okay, not to you all. But I left off on June the 3rd initially, even before my last recording. But anyway, let's go back to the church on June the 3rd, what God gave me on June the 3rd, where God says the church will not avoid its own exposure of corruption. And that's what's happening. The church is not exempt from its payments due as well. In other words, you have a debt owed as well. Kenneth Copeland said, judgment is coming. Well, if judgment is coming, judgment begins at the house of God. So what are you saying? You're saying exactly what I'm saying. The church is not exempt from its payments due as well. He says the church is to receive its just due in this season as well, for the church itself is corrupt. God told me that. The church is full of corruption. God told me that. The church has become the most corrupt of all systems. Your God told me that. And my God didn't tell you that. Yes, he did. That is correct. God says when it comes to the realignment of the world's systems, the church has played a poor and shameful role in realigning the world's systems. He says for centuries, the church has refused to address the systemic racism that prevails throughout the world. He says the problem of racism is so prevalent throughout the societies of this world, and the church has done very little to end it. He says the systemic racial overtone of society has received very little addressing from the church, which is due to the fact that the church is lucratively benefiting from the decay of the world and its systems. He says, for the lucrativeness of the systems of this world flow through the church. He says the church is paying out to the world's systems to keep those systems and their systemic racism running as they were designed to. He says the church has benefited from the racism that exists in the world. He says the church is literally benefiting from where the world is in its decay. The church, he says, is in support of the corruption of the systems that are in existence. Those who are within the church are the very ones who make up the systems of this world, God says. They are the same ones who are in the different systems of society. He says the church has become part of the problem within society. He said the church is the problem. The church is the problem that our societies have. The problems of our society is the church, and we don't even realize it because the church is the root of the systems that are oppressing us, that were systemically designed to oppress us, and the systemic setup of the systems that are oppressing us today comes from the one system of the church. Because those who came over here to this divided states of America and stole the land from its rightful owners were the ones who brought their Bibles and their beliefs. Kenneth Copeland, you said this yourself. Now, you didn't say it like I'm saying it, but you said that they came over here with their Bibles and their God, and they established a righteous nation with unrighteous behavior, killing and raping and robbing and enslaving. Okay, the church has become part of the problem of society, God says. The church is the problem. He said people are looking for the church to address the world of its racial issues when the church has yet to address itself of its own racial issues. He's saying, listen, people are looking for the church to address the issues of the world when it comes to the racial inequalities and injustices of this world, when the church itself has yet to address its own self of its own racial issues. God says, for the systems that exist throughout the world are due to the corruptness of the church. He said the only reason that the systems that are here that are oppressing the people and causing all of these issues in healthcare, in the economic world, in the workplace, in housing, in the legal system, in the political system, and in other systems and industries. He said the only reason that they still exist, or that they even exist at all, is because it's due to the church and its corruptness. So the corruptness of the systems are due to the corruptness of the church. Kenneth Copeland, you're basically saying what God told me. You know how you saying it in an opposite way, because you said that you said that the church set up all of this. Yeah, okay. So if the church set it up, then you're admitting that we are the problem. In fact, in your own words, you stated the world is the way it is because of the church. So what am I saying differently that God told me? Because the church is the problem, God says. The church has not been able to address the problem. When you are the problem, how are you going to address the problem? Again, the black pot can't say to the kettle, the black kettle, why are you so black? What? Because the church has not been able to address itself. God says the world has received its structure from the structure of the church. Do you know the church structure is the world structure? And I used to think that it was the world structure that has now become the church structure. That's what the church wants you to believe. The church wants you to believe that it's so holy, so pure, so rightly put together that when you see issues, it's only because part of the world bled into the church. God is saying, no, part of the world did not bleed into the church like that. All of the church bled into the parts of the world that we're referring to. He says the world has received its structure from the structure of the church. He says, for the structures of our churches have become the structures of our societies. Our societies are looking like our churches, not our churches looking like our societies. Our churches look as our societies do because our churches have projected itself or propelled itself out into society, out throughout the world, that now the world is looking like the church. But the church likes to say, we're looking like the world. No, y'all got your equal resemblances, but the world got its from you. You didn't get yours from it. God says the structures within our societies mimic the structures within our churches. Notice he didn't say the structures within our churches mimic the structures within our societies. He said, no, the mimicking comes from the church's side, or society mimicking the church, not the church mimicking the society. He says throughout the world, our societies are the mirror images of the churches that are located within those societies. God says the church is as ill as the systems of our different societies. The church is as ill as our society is. So if the church is as ill as our societies are, or our society is, how do we ever get to the point of thinking that the church is supposed to be able to pull us out of anything? God says the ills of the church are the ills of our different societies. He didn't say the ills of our societies are the ills of the church. No, the ills of the church have bled over into the ills of our society. He says those within the church, meaning those who make up the church, are as ill as those that the church is supposed to, or that they're supposed to have an effect upon. Listen again. Those within the church, meaning those who make up the church, are as ill as those that the church is supposed to have an effect upon. The church is just as ill as our society. So how is the church going to come and bring any wholeness to a society of the very issues that the church itself is ill or suffering an illness alike, or suffering like illnesses? As equally ill members of our society, the church is no longer able to address the societal ills of this world due to its own like ills, God says. Society's bleedings are the church's bleedings. Society is only bleeding from the wounds that the church inflicted. The society is only bleeding out the blood that the church bled upon society. He says the bleeding of our churches are the bleedings of our society. You see the same identical bleeding inside the church house as you see outside in the so-called world. Well, the bleeding members of the church come from the bleeding societies of the church. It was the bleeding members of the church who created the different societies, or make up the different societies that we have, the different systems that we have, the different neighborhoods, communities, nations, countries that we have. The problems of racism, God says, have become part of the pillars of the church. He says part of the pillars of the church includes racism. Anything that's a pillar is a supporter of. The church has always been supported by its racism. Remember, race is how the church was formed. Races form the church. R-A-C-E-S, not R-A-C-I-S-T-S. Races formed the church. Races, the race, for the most part, the Caucasian race, they founded the structure of the church, and part of their founding structures, or their founding pillars, was their racism. Their ism, their ideologies, their ideas, their concepts, their perception of their superiority over society, their superiority over blacks, more human than blacks. God says the problem of racism has become part of the pillars. All of that built the pillars of the church. Well, the church is never going to tear that pillar down, because then the church would crash and crumble. God says the church is spreading its own issues throughout the different societies of the world. He said the church is bleeding. The church's bleedings have bled over into every sector of our different societies. He says the ones who are bleeding within and throughout our societies are reminiscent of the ones who are bleeding out in the churches that are located throughout our societies. He says it is the church that is bleeding out its own issues upon society, which is why the problems of society throughout the world are the problems of the church throughout the world. You will see the same pattern throughout the world. The problems that's in our society, or in our different societies, you will see those same problems in the church. The problems of racism exist throughout the world because the problems of racism exist throughout the church. If it wasn't true for the church, then it wouldn't be a part of society. God, and then now people say, well, I know sins that. No, you don't. No, you don't. The world is full of race, God says. He says race is the fabric of the universe, human race. God says race makes up the fabric of the universe. He says that the universe is fabricated in race. He said racism is within the fabric of the universe. Countries are established and were established in racism. The United States was established in racism. He said religion itself has its establishment in race. You say, now, how does religion have its establishment in race? God says, for it is the human race, meaning human beings, who established religion. Oh, God says religion has its establishment in racism. He says racism is woven into religion. Oh my goodness. Religion has its establishment in racism. Because you got to remember, racism is just speaking about the perception of a particular group of people of a particular race, the ideologies, their contradictions and their hypocrisies, but their ideologies, their ideas, their concepts, their perception that for some reason they are better than other groups. They are worth more than other groups. They are more human than other groups, other races, other groups of people with different skin color. So God says religion is woven into the church, and we know it is. He says race is woven into religion because it was the human race that brought forth religion. And then religion is woven into the church. And then he says racism, which is woven into religion. Religion is nothing but racism to a certain degree. It's the belief that my belief is higher than yours, that my God is more superior than yours, that my group and how we worship is the only way, that America is only Christian and damn the Muslims and whoever else. Silly, silly, silly people. God says racism, which is woven into religion, which is woven into church, the church, racism woven into the church, yes, is within the fabric of the church. The very fibers, the very fabric of the church is based upon, all right then, race to the ism. I know that's rough. I know that's hard, but this is what God told me. And guess what? I believe it. Let's put it this way. I'll believe it before I believe anything that somebody else is saying. God has given me some truths here, and I believe in these truths. God says the church speaks of, when he speaks about the church, it speaks of the entity itself. It speaks about the systems of its religion, its beliefs. The church speaks of the members who consider themselves as being the essence of the church's body. The church speaks of those who claim to be the church, who claim to be the ecclesia, called out ones. God says churches were, I was going to say something there. The churches, the ecclesia, the called out ones, the ones who have been called out of their right mind. Churches were established in racism. Churches were established in racism. The church itself was founded within its own racial divide, within its own racial isms. within its own racism. God says those within the church founded themselves upon their own racial beliefs, upon their race-related beliefs, upon their own racism. And somehow we don't even see that. We don't accept that. He says the walls of the church were established by the races of those within the church. The walls of the church were established by the races of those within the church. The walls of the church, I'll peek you and say the walls of the church refers to the belief structures of the church, because the belief structures of the church are what founded the church itself, the buildings themselves, the belief structures. So the walls represent beliefs. That's what God told me. The walls of the church were established by the races of those within the church, the RACES, or by the race of those within the church. I don't know if there were multiple races or the race. The walls of the church were established by the races of those within the church. The walls of the church were established in the racism of those within the church. The walls of the church were established in the racism of those within the church. Because your belief is always structured, or your racism is always structured by your belief system. What makes you racially divided is your belief structure, your belief systems. What makes a person who is divided in his issues, in the issues of race, for the most part, causes them to become a person who's racist. When your ideologies and when your concepts and your perceptions, they supersede God, they supersede everything that is not like you. And only you and yours are that chosen group. Everyone else outside of you, you speak down to, you treat in a manner that is unequal, that shows forth inequality and injustice, not justice for all. God says the walls of the church represent the established beliefs of the members of the church. Do you know that your beliefs are what establishes the walls that divide you and separate you from all others? God says the walls of the church were created by the internal beliefs of its members. Oh my goodness. The external walls of the church were created by the internal beliefs of its members. Wow, that is very, very interesting. Very interesting. Think about that. Just think about it. God says the beliefs of the church's members, who are the members that make up the church body. He says the belief of the members of the church established their beliefs within systems of racism. Oh, within systems of racism. He says the racial beliefs of the church have established the racial beliefs within the church. The racial beliefs that the members of the church possess is what established the religious beliefs within the church. Oh my goodness. He said the church's religion is established in its racism. The church's religion is established in its racism. And you don't think that to be true? Go test a Christian out, and you will find out that their religion is based upon their racism, based upon their concept, based upon their ideology in relation to their race, their skin color versus that of others. The church established its religious beliefs within the fabric of its racism. It was the fabric of the church's racism that brought forth the establishment of the church as an entity and as a building. He says the church has enclosed itself within its own walls of religion and racism. He says Through its walls of religion and racism, the church has become a closed or an enclosed entity. He said, your beliefs establish your systems. It's your beliefs that establish your systems. Your beliefs as it relates to race establish your systematic approach to the subject of race. He said, your belief as it relates to race is what establishes your systematic approach to the subject of race. How you respond to the issues of race is based upon how you believe regarding the subject of race. How you respond to the issues of race is based upon how you believe regarding the subject of race. He said, your outlook and approach to the issues of racism will be determined by the walls of belief that you have established regarding race in general. Your outlook and approach to the issues of racism will be determined by the walls of beliefs that you have established regarding race in general. How you deal with racism, what type walls you build regarding whatever, will be based upon how you feel in general regarding race. He says your outlook and approach to the issues of racism will be determined by the walls of belief that you have established regarding race in general. How you see a thing, how you deal with the thing, church, is going to be determined by your beliefs regarding race in general. He said the walls that you establish through the beliefs that you hold will determine the approach that you will have when it comes to the problem of racism. The problems of racism. The walls that you establish through the beliefs that you hold will determine the approach that you will have when it comes to the problems of racism. He said the matter of racism is what establishes what walls are erected by and within the church. He says the church is established in racism, in its own racism. He says the church is rooted in its own belief system of racism or based upon racism. He says the system of the church holds its beliefs in racism. He says the church has its earliest roots in racism. He says not only is the church an established institution of racism, but it is the church that instituted racism itself. And still they would shoot me down for saying this. The church, God says, institutionalized its rooted beliefs as it relates to its own racism. The church took his own racially divided beliefs, racial superiority, its own beliefs in regards to that, and institutionalized it. And now it's just another working system, just another working institution within all the systems, throughout the societies of this world. He says both the complacency and the complicity of the church as it pertains to racism has caused the church to be mocked. He said the church is being laughed at because of its own complacency and its own complicity. Now, I said several times over that I am into, how did I say that there? That I am into giving you all definitions when it is applicable, or, well, not saying that definitions aren't always applicable, but only certain definitions do I take the time to go over or teach regarding, only because, how would I say it? Only because I try to only go with words that I know every word doesn't need to be defined, or some words you can define on your own. So I don't deal with those words that you can define on your own. But there are certain times and certain words that I will take the time where I define all of the words that I feel need to be defined. However, I don't always go over them. So there's only certain words that I'll see when I'm going over these things with you, as to having a need to be brought forth or having a greater need to be spoken out about. And there are a few words here. Oftentimes we'll use words so often that we won't even recognize the potency, the truths, the principles that are just in definitions alone, or in the meaning of a word alone. Like when we talk about race, it's a group of people who identify themselves as being distinct from other groups because of some supposed physical or genetic trait shared by that particular group. It's really the human race, but because we deal with racism and all, it's any one section of mankind having a particular set of characteristics which makes it different from another section or from other sections. A group of people who identify themselves as being distinct from other groups because of some, again, supposed physical or genetic trait that they share. Racism is about a distinctive doctrine or system or theory or practice that makes or denotes a stark difference between one group of people and another group of people. It says that it's the belief that race accounts for differences in human character or ability, and that a particular race is superior to others. Racism. The church built upon the doctrine, the system, the theory, the practice, the intrinsic flaw, the ideology, the idea that one's own race is more superior and has the right to control others. It's a hatred or an intolerance of another race over other races. Wow. It's the prejudice that members of one race are intrinsically superior to members of other races. Discriminatory or abusive behavior towards members of another race. Isn't that something? God says the church was founded in that. That seems very hard, I know, but it seems exactly as God made it seem when he said it to me. To you, you're probably feeling how I felt. Now, I know that that's not easy for some people to accept, but you know what? It's not for me to struggle with it. Really, well, I was going to say it's not for you to struggle with, but you know what? Oftentimes, God means for there to be a struggle. God means for us to struggle for certain things. Why? Because we come into knowing in our struggles. We come into a greater, how would I say, a greater place of knowing. I'll put it that way. A greater place of knowing through struggling. You struggle. You know, not Pharaoh. I probably could use Pharaoh in some stretch sense, but I'll go with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, it wasn't until after he experienced living like an animal, so the book says, living like a beast of the field, that he came to say, now I know that God rules in the kingdom of man. Now I know. Now I know. The other two words that I want to deal with, and we'll close out, I used the word, or God spoke to me and used the word complacent and complicity. Complacent, C-O-M-P-L-A-C-E-N-T, and complicity, C-O-M-P-L-I-C-I-T-Y, or complicit. Complacent means self-satisfied, unbothered, unconcerned. Just, it is what it is, almost like nonchalant, content with the way that it is, content with the fault with oneself or one's actions, satisfied or showing satisfaction with things as they are, showing satisfaction with one's own situation. The church has become complacent, satisfied in where it's been, where it has always been, who it is. It's almost like Donald Trump. He's content in where he's at. He even said, I don't see a need to ever repent of anything. Just satisfied. The word complicit means, it says, associated with or participating in a questionable act or a crime. The church is complicit. Why? Because the church is associated with the very crimes of our societies. Having complicity, it's involved with others in reprehensible or illegal activity. The way the church is so complicit with the Washington political system, the way that the church is completely complicit with the behavior of the now president, the way that the church is completely complicit in what is happening in the legal system and in the justice system, all of this in the health systems and the issues of racism and all, the injustices, the inequalities. Complicit, meaning involvement, again, as an accomplice in an act or crime. The factor or condition of being an accomplice, especially in a criminal act, partnership or involvement in wrongdoing, the state of having committed an offense. Now let's go back to what God said in that. He says both the complacency and the complicity of the church as it pertains to racism has caused the church to be mocked, because the church is so satisfied with the way things are in our world and society. Because the church is so complicit, the church is an accomplice, the church is just as guilty. The church itself has committed the crime of racism, has founded itself upon racism, its own racism. He says the church is now being mocked. Yes, because you're contradicting yourself. You're being a hypocrite. Because of its own racial and religious divide, God says the church has become ineffective in dealing with the racial and religious divides that exist throughout the world. He says because of its religious and racial divides, the church has lost its effectiveness in dealing with the issues of religion and race. He says the problem of racism has infested the church, infected the church, to the point that the church has lost its effectiveness. You're so infected that you can't even effect. The church has become as powerless and ineffective as any other system in the universe in relation to racism and change. God says the church has failed to recognize its own state. Throughout this pandemic season, the church has refused to accept the state of its own relevancy. The church is being mocked by the people within its own communities because of its failed attempts, the church's failed attempts to maintain some form of relevancy during and prior to this season. God says the church has lost its relevancy. The church is no longer able to affect because it's so infected with the very ills of our society, because it is the infector of the ills of our society. The systems were designed by the infection of the church. The church is why the systems are so infected. So, Kenneth Copeland, when you say that the problem lies on the shoulders of the church, you are correct, even though you don't think so, sir. Even though you use it in a different manner, you are correct in its literal meaning, according to what God told me. The church has become as powerless and ineffective as any other system in the universe in relation to racism and change. Just like all the other systems of this universe have failed to deal with the issues of racism, so has the church. God says the church has failed to recognize its own state. Throughout the pandemic season, he says the church has refused to accept the state of its own relevancy, which is no relevancy. The church is being mocked by the people within its own communities because of the church's failed attempts to maintain some form of relevancy during and prior to the season. In other words, the world is looking at a church that no longer has relevance, a people that no longer have relevance in today's society and where God is bringing us through this pandemic season, because the church has failed to realize it, and the church is doing everything that it can to try to maintain some form of relevancy. You're dipping your noses into stuff you shouldn't be in. You're trying to make a problem, to create a problem, to make yourself look like an arsonist. You know how an arsonist goes and set a fire and then goes and try to put the fire out to show the people, look, I'm a good man. Look what I did. No. You're an arsonist. You started the fire. You're not a hero. You are not a hero. You're creating a problem so you can be the hero. The church is creating problems to become the problem solvers, to make themselves seem more relevant to the ills of our society than they actually are. You wretched church. God says even though the church has lost its relevancy, and I'm wrapping up, even though the church has lost its relevancy throughout its communities, the church still wants to be relevant within its communities. You can't be relevant, silly, if you've lost your relevance. In its attempts to become relevant, the church has become the laughingstock of the communities that it seeks to regain its relevance from or within. The church has become useless in the fight for justice. The church has become forceless toward change. The church has become nothing but another entity within society that is powerless toward change. Wow. That is a lot said to me. And my throat is kind of worn, to say the least. It takes a lot to put this information out. It takes a lot to break this information down in a way that you can understand it. It takes a lot from me mentally, spiritually, definitely physically. But it is what it is. And it's worst. It's worth the pain, the discomfort, the tiredness. It's worth the effort. We'll continue on with this on the next one. Thank you.